two.
Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, speaking to you from the Prince Conference Center at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with another episode of Marksism with fellow editors and fellow Marks, Mark Leibecke and Mark Melton, looking at three pieces from Providence this week. One by Dutch contributor Simon Polinder on Moral-Realism. What is that? Another piece by our contributor Debra Erickson on remembering our own morality and democracy as we address the Ukraine war. And finally, a piece from 75 years ago from Reinhold Niebuhr's Christianity in Crisis magazine, this quote unquote of foreign aid written by a Methodist minister. But first, let's go to Simon Polinder's piece on moral realism. Perhaps Mark Leibecke can help us distinguish between his vision of moral realism versus Christian realism. But in essence, if I understand Polinder correctly, he's in addressing Ukraine, arguing for some sort of settlement with Russia that may be unsavory and unsatisfactory, but the most morally and realistically possible end to a horrible and tragic situation. Am I understanding his proposal correctly, Mark Leibecke?
Yeah, I think you are. And it's an interesting piece in that I think and quite likely we largely agree with him. I think he largely gets the math correct. There are quibbles that I have with maybe the way he's sort of worked out the sum, to keep that analogy going. The difference, I think, between his term moral realism and our traditional use of the term Christian realism, I have a feeling that they can or might be able to be used synonymously. He's trying to make distinctions that we make. He's trying to make distinctions between moral realism and moralism, which we would certainly make the same sort of jumps. We argue extensively that the Christian realist stands opposed to idealism, stands opposed to utopianism. And so as he moves through his analysis of moral realism as an alternative to moralism, I think he gets the outcomes largely correct. I think we've largely assumed in our pages that the Ukraine war is likely to end with certain concessions being made to Putin and his regime that are unsavory. Now, maybe those concessions are simply that we don't bring the full extent of justice that is due to Putin. Maybe it has nothing to do with land concessions, but it might. And that's on the table. It might have to do with Zelensky and the Ukrainian government pledging to some kind of neutrality, all of which are unsavory. Putin has no right to request these things. We ought not to give him these things, but the world being what it is, at the end of the day, those might be the best of the available options. All that said, I do have some quibbles with what he writes in his analysis of the limitations of moralism. Some of that is just a little bit confusing to me, and it's probably just a cocktail conversation away from clarification. But he seems to equate moralism with the pointing finger, he says, which leads to admonishment and punishment. He then seems to go on to say that moral realism allows for punishment. So I'm not quite sure the distinction he makes there between moralism and moral realism when it comes to the wagging finger and the punishment. We'll see in Debra Erickson's piece where she boldly wags the finger at Putin and says, "You are wrong. You have absolutely no basis to be making this attack whatsoever. You are threatened by nothing. If you say you are, you're simply wrong." And again, Polinder seems to acknowledge that Putin's statements about maybe feeling threatened aren't necessarily true simply because he says them. Statements he says aren't justification. So we agree on that. But his definition of moralism is a little bit strange. He also seems to suggest that because the international world is acephalic, there's no head, there's no leader of the international world, that making these kinds of judgments is difficult because really what we're dealing with is a clash of worldviews, to which I agree, it's difficult. But I don't hesitate to suggest that we can make them, which for me is simply an argument for, in this case, American primacy. I think there should be a hegemon. I think it should be a benevolent hegemon that gives other nations as much freedom as they can bear, so long as they don't sort of mess with the common good. That's power politics as well. It's a realistic view of the way the world works. I'm fearful maybe that one additional area of disagreement would be that he seems to suggest maybe not a rapprochement with Russia, or maybe not even a détente, but that we need to understand Putin's worldview in such a way that we can exercise a kind of empathy that makes us realize, well, he's not entirely to blame. And none of that is wrong. But at the same time, I don't think it's rapprochement anymore that's on the table. It's not détente that's on the table. It's deterrence. The man needs to be deterred. We need to figure out how to do that. So again, I think it's a family squabble. I think we're very closely aligned. It's an interesting piece. I'm glad we published it, and I think it's a good conversation starter.
As you say, he seemed to bend overboard in wanting to grant that Putin's narrative should not be dismissed as irrational, but at least listened to. So are we never permitted to denounce any narrative as irrational, much less wicked or evil? How far do we take that perspective?
Yeah, correct. I think that's my hesitation with it too. And when we talk about Deborah's piece, I think we'll see the alternative to his piece.
The book ends. Well, we'll jump to Deborah's piece, but first, this piece from Christianity Crisis from 1948 by this Methodist cleric on the so-called foolishness of foreign aid, in which he declines to make a argument for massive U.S. foreign aid based on realism and how American interests would be advanced by reconstructing war-torn Europe and Japan, but rather simply the Christian moral ethical imperative of helping those in need should of itself suffice for pushing this forward, not just as individuals or as a church, but as the United States as a nation. Mark Melton, what are your thoughts on this suggestion?
Yeah, like you said, it's 1947. He writes this piece. This is before the Marshall Plan is really, I'm not sure exactly when Marshall Plan was proposed or brought forward to the public, but it wasn't passed, I believe, until 48, but they start debating it in 47. So he writes this before that happens. And he is talking about how we in the United States during World War II blew up and destroyed a lot of Europe, a lot of Asia, and is now spending money to make those places better, to feed the people, to help them recover. And he is basically bringing up like there's a bit of foolishness here. And like you said, he doesn't try to explain this through some type of enlightened interest or to say in the long term this would be good for America if these areas were not completely shelled out and they were actually rebuilt and stable societies again. He doesn't make that argument. He just says that Christianity requires Christians to do things that from a purely materialistic perspective is irrational. And on that point, I'm kind of reminded by years ago from when my graduate degree, I read Kenneth Boulding. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a Quaker pacifist who wrote, he basically helped create conflict studies, but he had a quote in one of his books I thought was interesting about how, Christians or people will hunger and thirst because they hunger and thirst after righteousness. In other words, people are willing to sacrifice to make the world better because they are, because of the desire for righteousness in the world. And I think that I kind of see that here where the idea is, we are willing to sacrifice, even if these people don't like us at the end of the day, even if, the Germans still hate us for whatever reason. The point isn't to make them like us. It is because God loved us. So we must love other people. And I think you can see that in both this international context and also within personal lives and our personal, like we are supposed to help people, not to influence them, not to make them like us, but because we're paying off pay off all your debts except for the debt of love, because you're never able to pay off that debt that we owe to God. And so you see a lot of those themes here, and it's a fairly short piece. Like, so if people want to read it, it's only what, a 4-minute read, and so it's not that complicated. It's pretty simple. And Humphrey Lee, we've published a couple other things from Christianity in Crisis from him, but he was apparently a big deal in Texas. I think there are some schools actually named after him. So I might have to double check that source, but yeah, it's worth reading.
He sounds like a good Methodist, for better or not, in terms of his moralism and his perfectionism, but perhaps more on that later. Speaking of moralism, on to Debra Erickson's piece. I'm going to quote from her conclusion. The West is not responsible for Putin's war, but Western democracies are responsible for whether they live by the values that set them apart from the values that animate Putin's imperial fantasy, and for whether they defend those values against attack by fashionable opinion makers, religiously inspired revanchists, or murderous dictators. She specifically cites earlier in her piece Elizabeth Brunig of The Atlantic, who apparently proposes a leftist argument for non-intervention, suggesting that would save more Ukrainian lives than not. I don't think Debra is being moralistic. I think there is some practicality and pragmatism in her moral arguments. But what say you, Mark Leibecki?
Oh, yes. This is me doing my happy dance for Debra. Absolutely. Christian realism writ large, right? So you quote from the end of her piece, I'll quote from the beginning of her piece, which is essentially, she's just bringing it back full circle. She says, Russia's war on Ukraine is a textbook example of an unjust, unprovoked war of aggression. Russia faced no security threat other than the threat that democratic ideas pose to Putin's rule. So it's clear, it's unequivocating. We can make moral distinctions. We can discern the good from evil, right from wrong, guilt from innocence. We can do all those things. And then she demands, in good Christian realist and Elsteinian fashion, that not only do we make those distinctions, but we act on them. And then she has the caveat. There are times where, once the first shot is fired, the plan goes to hell in a handbasket. That's taken for granted. And therefore, the irony or the unpredictability of action is important, and it provides something of an important constraint. And so there are times where, as we look into the corridors of the future, where we don't know what's going to happen, we don't know exactly how to move correctly, and that should counsel caution. But she doesn't think this is one of those cases. Where the ambiguity is so strong that you're unsure of what to do. Maybe the safest thing to do is to fall back on your duty. And she argues, I think correctly, that American or Western duty in this case is pretty clear. We ought to come to the aid of the Ukrainians. Prudently so, carefully so. We ought not to act so rashly that we, create World War III or help bring it about. But she doesn't shirk from her duty, and she recognizes that it is in our interests to defend moral principles. And so here I think she again provides something of a helpful corrective to maybe some of the smaller details in Polinder's piece, where he says at one point, it seems to be something of a concession, where he says it is sometimes right to use power out of love for justice. That might be a moral realist's position. Debra argues she would agree with that, but I think she would also then say it's also sometimes right to pursue justice out of love. It works in reverse. Justice can be a manifestation of love, and it's love for both victims, and it's love also for the enemy, which is a strong just war claim. So I think her piece is wonderful. I think she's right to wag the finger at the West and to ask why it is in the first place that Western powers have found ourselves in so many ways hand-tied in our ability to respond to Putin's aggression. And she recognizes that that we do have some blame there, which again goes back, I think, maybe in an indirect way to Polinder's complaint in the acephalic nature of the world, where there's no hegemon who can make the judgments. I would say here that if America continued to be a reliable world leader and exercised its primacy in such a way that our allies were content with the security that we helped to maintain, predominantly helped to maintain in the world, that some of the turn toward Russia wouldn't have happened. Germany would still be able to rely, I think, on energy concessions from the West, rather than turn and tie themselves more tightly to Russia, on and on and on. I think American primacy would have resolved a lot of the crisis we now see playing out in the Ukraine. So there it is. 3 cheers for Debra.
Well, we commend Debra for the muscular nature of her Christian realism. Let me, in closing, note that I'm in Grand Rapids for a presentation that I gave yesterday, along with our Providence contributors, Keith Pavlicek, Daryl Charles, and David Baer. All of us contributed chapters to the forthcoming book called Just War and Christian Traditions, to be published by University of Notre Dame Press later this year. So be on the lookout. It was a wonderful conversation, and the book covers pretty much everything you need to know about what the various Christian traditions have to say about just war teaching. Gentlemen, thank you for this latest episode of Marksism. Until next week, bye-bye.